if you represent truth, you don't need to write on your forehead, I'm truth, because that's the emanation. You don't even need to speak about politics or anything. It's just there. Your people will perceive what you are somewhat if they have that perception. But if you want to write, I have achieved this, I have done this, even in all these, what is written, have I ever written what I have achieved or not achieved? I am not interested in telling people what I've experienced. But if they come to me and say, what do you think I'm experiencing? And I'm telling them exactly what they're experiencing. If they don't like the answer, well, then don't ask me. Yes, it's true. People can, go astral travel. They can surge out of the body. They can go and travel all over in the subtle body. So what? How do you integrate yourself in everyday life? What do you experience? How do you experience life? So, and this existence here is very painful. It's painful for higher consciousness because it's a very low vibrational existence, unfortunately.
So how it is when people travel like this? They still see, like they have normal eyes, or
consciousness has all the senses.
like in a dream?
Like in a dream, yes. Are you there in a dream? You can retain some sense of partially like your body, but you believe you see through eyes in your dream, but you don't. There are no eyes there.
Yeah,
it's the memory of your identity as you are in the living now.
like the intention.
Yeah, it's like, because when you're in a dream, it's the energy that you're reading, but your consciousness interprets it into symbols. It's the energy of that person, and now you make this person look like this. It's interpretation of the dream, of the energy, which happens through your own consciousness. So for example, you perceive energy and you say, oh, I recognize this energy. This is the energy of my mother. And consciousness instantly creates in a dream image of the mother. But it's all energy. If you see me, let's say in a dream, again, it's some sort of energy that your consciousness recognizes, oh, it must be Jivanmukti. Because it's that frequency that comes, which you recognize as that. It's not 100% that it's always Jivanmukti, because sometimes it can also be a play. There can be moments that people see something, but it's not so. Some entities can also simulate energy and appear as, let's say, Jivanmukti, but it's not Jivanmukti, okay?
So and it's a common, like a platform for all, or is just in our own consciousness?
It's a collective pool. It's a collective consciousness. You're a part of this collective consciousness, right? So you're a part. When you are dreaming, you kind of exit into the frequency of the collective. And you are dealing with different energies, but usually you will not go far. You will mostly deal with energies which are familiar or that you're kind of used to. So you will mostly roam around the energies that are important for you, for your consciousness. Let's say if you constantly are in touch with certain people, so these people, their energies may pop up in you because their energies are a part of your consciousness. Even though you live in the body, when you are in an expanded state of dream or even beyond, you are dealing with these energies. These energies are like archetypes within your consciousness. So it's like, for example, your friend, or several friends may have the same frequency as your mother, or the father. So they represent your mother or father. But your mother archetype is just split now into several fragments, which is mother and also friends, maybe. If your sister reminds you of the mother, so sister is some kind of a branch of the same mother archetype, right? Your girlfriend may be the same mother archetype or your father archetype. So you understand what I mean?
Yeah, so there are branches of the same trunk.
Archetype. So there are two archetypes, and then whoever else related to this, or any images related. So these are just energy splits or energy fragments, or some sort of energy fields which are actually a part of one and the same field.
Yeah.
You know? And that's how we can work with dreams, that we can understand how it's, you know, different archetypes, but they're not just archetypes, they are energies. They're kind of like energy whirlpools. So these energy whirlpools arise, or we access the collective consciousness, and the part of that collective which is familiar to us, which is close to us. If there is something else about to manifest, let's say you're doing spiritual work or refinement, you are refining yourself, clearing up certain, let's say, karmic experiences, entanglements with certain energies. Once you cleared up something, maybe some new energy may be invoked, but it's invoked from the collective. Again, it's kind of from within. So you're dealing with a new type of energy, but it's not actually new. It's just that a new layer, you got access to a new layer now, psychologically, spiritually. But it is still within you. It's just that now, after you cleared up the first layer, first layers,
yeah, you have access to something else.
the new energy arises, and that's why, or that's when you may start seeing different dreams of things or places or energies that are not familiar, and these energies turn into images, or your consciousness interprets them as something not very familiar, as something exotic, as something foreign, as something absolutely out of your normal scope of awareness and dream even. So if you constantly had certain dreams, now you have different scope of dreams. Sometimes when you're going through different kind of turbulent events or some kind of challenging moments, you may start seeing some kind of natural, so you access a very deep layer of the collective. So you start seeing storms, tornadoes, some kind of lightnings or something like that in your dreams, which signify that something new is coming, something is changing, something is cracking open in your subconscious. But it's still this, what we call subconscious is actually the collective, which we access. But we are also expanding our individual within the collective, because even though we're all a part of the collective, we still have our individual field, and this field includes everything which is familiar to us. But now it starts cracking open, and it kind of widens and expands. And that's where, when people are refining spiritually, they start expanding. They sometimes start having these sort of astral journeys, or they travel in the collective more consciously, or they start accessing areas or some kind of other information within the collective which has not been familiar, which is not a part of their natural field, you may say. And so they may have different kind of visions. Maybe they access information beyond their current, like an active awareness, because they're actually expanding their awareness on the collective, and it manifests through some kind of an unusual dream. Or maybe they access the collective knowledge now of their ancestors. So it's still within their sort of field, but it's expanded. So now it's the information of their ancestors. Maybe they start getting access to the knowledge of their forefathers, maybe some mythical knowledge, or seems like spiritual. Maybe they start dreaming of some kind of spiritual elements, maybe demigods, or they have some symbolic meanings and stuff like that in dreams, because they start accessing their ancestral. And also, then if they expand further, they might start accessing information from their past, meaning, but again, this past is only relevant for our kind of living body now, because we comprehend everything like past, present, future. But in the collective, it's just like a pool of information. So you start accessing some kind of information that you had access to before in maybe previous incarnations or something else. And so it expands and enriches also your understanding of existence. So maybe you start experiencing some emotions which you don't normally experience in the, in an active state. So these emotions indicate something. You may work, you may do deeper spiritual work, deeper refinement when you have these, when you have this access, and when you can actually invoke those subtler layers within the collective self, or which is still related to your current individual being. So it's a very interesting, like dreams are, I mean, I wouldn't like to call it a dream. I would like to call it an access to the collective. It can be an invaluable spiritual tool, but only when you really know what you're going through and what you're doing. You understand what is happening. You have certain guidance of someone who knows what they're talking about, or they had that experience. Because otherwise, it's very easy to get lost also doing this work, because you might get carried away by some symbols. Maybe you start having access to some subtle information that may mislead you, or you start creating, this is the danger, it's a trap, you start creating identification to those subtle images now. So before you were creating self-identification with your living environment or things or profession or people you're in touch with. But now you start creating also connections with these energies that you access in the dream state, these collective energies, and you start maybe creating a certain identity around it, or you link your identity around some experiences in your dreams. And this is where it could be a trap as well. So whatever we experience, whether in the physical reality or in the subtle reality, has to be taken for an experience. You dive into the experience, you understand what it is, you perceive it and dissolve it and let go. That's the goal of any refinement work, because otherwise it becomes a stuck point or a stagnation point for anyone. Because if you hold on to anything, whether it's a subtle experience or physical experience, it's a problem. So the work is not complete, and then people may even go into some kind of delusion. And it happens, for instance, when people stimulate the access to subtle dimension or to some other subtle dimension through drugs or different kind of stimulants. It's kind of similar situation, but then they try to access it, retaining some active part, active awareness, and it may completely delude them or create some kind of a split, an opening to that dimension without them actually being ready, being refined on the level of individuality, so that individuality is still corrupt, is still unrefined. And so when they have access to these kind of dimensions, it usually link their individuality and then get consumed by that dimension, or they start having split personalities or different kind of disorders that may be later on diagnosed as schizophrenia or psychosis or something like this, because there is unrefined trauma at the core, but they are looking for spiritual, maybe validation in subtle realms. So they're looking for something. Basically, these people look for healing, but they can't find healing. So they think that, okay, the spiritual means, which are again unexplored, attract them. So they go to different kind of these means, like taking some drugs, psychedelic drugs, or taking some herbal concoctions or something like that, in hope to heal and understand. But it doesn't happen in a split or a moment or in one trip or in one day, because it took time to shape the trauma to reach that corruption, you know. And so when they go for these quick fixes, as I say, or as I consider it, So they go into these, you know, quick fixes, but it doesn't usually fix anything. It just creates premature openings within the collective, kind of within them towards the collective. So it creates an opening, but it's a premature opening because it opens such layers which they're not ready to face. And even though it creates a huge impact, it usually causes more damage than a healing, because then it creates an addictive effect as well. Maybe they get attached to the actual experience because they think, okay, it gave me some clue. Now they start taking these type of drugs, psychedelic drugs, or some kind of herbal solutions more and more. And so it creates more and more opening and split where they're not actually aware of anything. They are not actively able to navigate through these different now energies to which they gained access. So what happens is they become confused. They become mentally confused, emotionally confused. They start perceiving energies that they can't handle. And so, but they're still codependent. They're still unsure, uncertain within themselves. They start going to all different kind of witch doctors, healers, asking for solutions without understanding how to handle these feelings and emotions and all this, what they accessed. And, you know, and those people also have no idea because they have limited understanding. So the result of it is eventually they either have psychotic episode or they start denying everything and going back to their kind of ego paradigm because they want to protect themselves from these energies because they have no guidance to how to face it safely, right? And so, yeah, it's a very serious matter. And so people are playing with these dream states and travels and all. They try to overstimulate their nervous system to gain some kind of access to a subtle dimension. But if you really want to understand what natural spirituality is, you should never attempt to force anything. It has to come naturally because you can only be what you are. You cannot be something that you're not. And if you try to stimulate or push something that you're not, it's going to backfire. And in majority of cases, it does. So it's very rare that, I mean, it's actually it never happens. People can create a false identity and live through this identity for a while, but they won't last long because eventually they crack. Eventually they have to face that falsehood they've created, and it's inevitable. And I think that when it happens through drugs or through some overstimulation, it just breaks them from within because why they were pushed to do it is because they never wanted to address their true cause, the true trauma. The trauma wasn't addressed. So they were coming into spirituality with the hope to escape from the trauma. But it led them to psychosis because you cannot cheat life. It will, if you can't face it right now in a natural and normal way, if you deny certain things, life will put your face down, especially if you try certain things which are kind of premature. And this is what I've faced throughout this time that I've been in this field. People delude themselves, even if they have some kind of spiritual experiences. The problem arises when they try to link up their unrefined, unhealed identity with these experiences, and again attached to some kind of a notion of I am now this or I am now that, and which kind of stagnates them, which deludes them and kind of pushes them somewhere where they shouldn't actually be if they understood this. So they take detours. They get stuck, they go into some kind of false spiritual paradigms that they create for themselves. You know, or even they can deny everything and fall again into some other extreme, like, okay, now I don't need spirituality, I only can exist in this material paradigm, which is again absurd. So true spirituality is always about this kind of a balance. It's a unity, it's a balance. It's not something that you have to create or go into something or now hold on to something as if it's everything for you. Because true spirituality is fluid. It doesn't believe in anything, doesn't disbelieve. It flows, it accepts, it lets go, and it's a constant flow. But for the majority of people who are attached to this dimension, everything is like a crust, everything is like a square. I hold on to this corner or to that corner, so they can't understand what fluidity is. And only when you understand flexibility, fluidity of being, then it's the first step, it's a foundation towards true knowledge. And at least you feel like I'm eligible because, and you don't even say to yourself that I'm eligible, you just understand that you no longer hold on to anything. But you may have experiences of anything, and yet you don't create another identity of any experience, you know? So you become like water that just like a flow that flows and experiences and enriches and understands, and yet doesn't define itself through any experience. That's the first step in spirituality towards true natural restoration of one's natural being. There's no other way.
Yeah. So basically, what we experience in the dream, and also I didn't had this kind of experience, but just the dreams. So it's more our interpretation, like, no, our mental norms. So
you see, we understand this dimension through interpreting energies. So we take a certain frequency, and our brain is tuned to this frequency and interprets it into a form. It builds it into a form. That's why we can say that we're sharing one dimension, because we have the ability to interpret the same vibrations kind of into a form. That's called dimension. But if we have access to energy which is subtler, which has higher frequency or different frequency, let's not put it higher, lower, but different frequency, then our brains cannot fully interpret it. So that's why dreams seem to be abrupt and fragmented, kind of, or even if images, yeah, even if they appear for a while, like for a short while as a flow, they're still abrupt and fragmented, is because the brain already fails kind of to have a coherent awareness through the subtle dimension, if especially one's awareness is limited still and rigid and locked only in one dimension. But once you're awakening, it means you're breaking through. You start having access and perception of a subtle dimension. So your consciousness starts rewiring the brain, and so you start becoming aware of sort of subtler type of frequencies, which you start again shaping into form. So you start being more aware, you may say, in that subtle dimension, because you start reading the subtle dimension clearer. So if before your dreams were very abrupt, very kind of unusual, maybe you could not even understand, and maybe usually for the majority of people, they forget their dreams. But now you become more aware. You start building these energies and frequencies into a coherent story. It means you start awakening to the subtle dimension, rebuilding that subtle dimension awareness, or kind of, I don't know how to say, but you start becoming aware of that subtle dimension. So you kind of rebuild your understanding of the subtle dimension within yourself, because you're becoming aware of your own being as a part of the subtle dimension. And so now your dreams are, you may say, more lucid, like people say, or you start even later on being able to navigate through that subtle dimension as well as you are navigating through the physical dimension. That's a different, again, story. And when people say I have that ability, it's good. You have that ability, but it doesn't mean anything again. You just got access to the subtle dimension, you mastered maybe subtle dimension, maybe you are able to be as aware and navigate as, because you mastered your subtle body, so you are able to navigate through the subtle dimension clearer, and you are able to read that subtle energies because you rewired your kind of understanding, comprehension. You're now aware of that dimension. It becomes kind of a solid to some degree as well. So we can only read frequencies of the dimension to the degree we're aware of ourselves. So if our awareness penetrates into that level of that subtlety, we start perceiving that subtlety as somewhat grosser. You understand? So no dimension is actually gross, but because we're sharing the same frequency, so we say, okay, this world is tangible for us because we on a collective level agree on this frequency dimension, so we can share and perceive it easily. And our brains are currently wired to this point, and our bodies are currently seemingly gross because we perceive this dimension as gross. But the subtle dimension is not perceived as gross. It's perceived as subtle, meaning more fluid. So even we can't sometimes say whether we are really the same looking in the dream, or we have the same looking body, or we're, so it depends, because we only have fragmental memory of our being in the subtle, because we don't have yet that fully established subtle identity, or that subtle identity is kind of blurred. It's blurred with different energies which we haven't refined. We have other people in that identity. We have archetypes, different energy elements, a lot of elements which are occulted from our active current awareness. And so that's why we call it a dream, because these are just different fragments of different frequencies and energies which are still present in our consciousness, but our current awareness is not complete or whole. So we are only aware of this spectrum. And now in the dream, we start being aware of this spectrum, but we're still not aware of the other spectrums of our existence, which are even subtler dimensions. And that's what makes us complete. That's where you can say that this is a wholesome awareness which has everything in it. But it breaches the point of individuality into collective and more universal. So it's very difficult to understand when just trying to understand from the point of I am an individual physical body, because we understand the body in a very limited sense. And so when you go into subtler dimensions, you have to have that type of a body. But the body meaning you have to have some kind of a more refined subtle identity. It means you have to have that awareness, your active awareness has to expand or penetrate into those subtler layers. And usually we think that subtler layers are like, again, we look at it from a human perspective, they're more expanded, but the truth is that they're actually more inward in comparison with our dimension, because our dimension thinks that something powerful has to be expanded and large. But it's on the contrary, because the more potent and the subtler the dimension, it's more minute in comparison with our current dimension, but it's more potent and it has more energy potential. So it's very difficult. It's like a reverse understanding. It's like when we speak about the quantum world, where a little particle can be more powerful than anything else in the physical reality. So we're talking about very subtle frequencies of existence, where if you want active conscious access to that, you have to also have that frequency within that developed frequency. You have to become aware of that stream of frequency within yourself, at least to a certain degree, so that you can recognize that. That's why most of the people are not aware of deep sleep. Once they start awakening, they perceive it as bliss, blissful state. The blissful states are penetrating their active state when they're aware of the physical body and they feel, oh, I feel so blissful, so nice. So basically they become aware of that dimension, but then now they are stuck. They just feel so blissful that they can't even do anything. They become drowsy. So they haven't mastered this bliss. They haven't mastered this understanding. And even though they feel bliss, it doesn't define anything, because it's just that they opened up to that frequency, but they haven't mastered. They don't know what that dimension is all about. So they don't have that, let's say, active awareness all the time of that dimension. And they don't understand the existence of that dimension. They only perceive it as bliss. That's it. That's just the very, very beginning. It's a sign of consciousness being awake, if it has reconnected with the blissful field. And that is not everything, because you go beyond that. It's the awareness that exists beyond any dimension, but can exist through any dimension, if you also have that ability to somewhat be consciously navigate through that dimension as a certain awareness which decides to have a certain, let's say, subtle identity too. So in order to exist on any dimension, you have to have some sort of created identity there, even on a subtle level. Something has to be there to read that dimension, to perceive it as more tangible. You know? That's why, you know, in Vedas, there are different lokas, they say, there are different realms of existence. That is because different higher frequencies exist there. But if you're of higher frequency and there's another higher frequency, you perceive each other as if you're in the same kind of a tangible frequency as bodies. You know, you perceive each other as bodies because you can read and interpret the energy, that frequency, as equal. So you see, let's say, the body because we share that on some level. But if you shared other frequency, if you were aware of higher frequencies, you would read those energies and would bring, your consciousness would read them, and some would bring them into some kind of subtle bodies or some kind of subtle existences, you know.
So at the beginning, it's more like our sets of mind, and after that, you experience, when you purify these things, you experience how it is actually, right? Or
you refine yourself. Refinement means dissolving certain identity crusts first. You see, the process of devolution which we reached now, and which we are trying to dissolve and kind of ascend from, but it's going to take thousands of years. So this point, the lower point, right, means that we have this short body that can get imbalanced and diseased, because that's, the body itself is karma, the vessel of corruption. Karma means the vessel of consciousness. Because this consciousness is corrupt, this body is karmic. This body itself is the residue of that corruption. Even if you're corrupt for a while, you have, and corruption does not mean only bad. It's a certain distortion, certain frequency that you maintain within your consciousness that allows you to exist on this dimension consciously. Right? Now, the process of evolution means that you start dissolving this corruption. Once you start dissolving the corruption, what happens is that your body starts perfecting, your body starts dissolving these attachments or these kind of elements, energies, which have been draining your consciousness, which have been causing decay to the body. So, but then after you're done, you create a subtle body, because the more you refine, the more you become subtle. Eventually you will dissolve the body, even if this body can be maintained for a very long time in comparison with the current bodies. Still, you will either dissolve this body or will exit this body. Maybe the body, when you exit, will not decompose, but it doesn't really matter at all, because this body may be dissolved into, you use the energy of, and you dissolve, because you already have the subtle identity shape. Why it's not that it's subtle identity that you have created, no, because it's actually that identity that has been refined, that has been pure. It's like you've taken something very pure out of a dirty water. So it has always been there, but you weren't aware of it because your focus was on that which has been transitory, that has been karmic, that has been a sign of that accumulated corruption through the down cycle. Now the process of evolution means refinement of the body. And this refinement of the body means, first, it's a refinement of all this mental, emotional, and it will result in a physical refinement. You will see that you are no longer getting sick. That's the point of yoga, that you're not decaying, that all this, but this is not a real achievement either. It's only the very beginning, because then you will dissolve eventually this body into the light. Again, that's what, into the light, it doesn't mean into the light, it's the actually subtle body. Depends on the level of, to which degree you refined yourself, so that you will have, because there are also, and again, you may call it light body, and this light body or immortal body, there are again different immortals, depending on to which degree you refined and what you refined and what you left. So that what you left will become your current identity. And if that is very, very subtle and very, very radiant, it will eventually dissolve the body. If not, you will probably just have like a ghost-like body, or some body which may look still human, but maybe you don't need to eat, or it doesn't feel cold or heat. But this is still not a very powerful achievement. Still, there is a lot of refinement to be done, but it's somewhat.
So, and that will be experienced in the dreamlike state, this ghost. And
there is more, yeah. The subtle dimension will appear more real, and one may also exist to that subtle dimension. But subtle dimension means one may maybe affect someone else's thoughts and emotions and stuff like that, because one has access, and one's identity is more blurred. It's not individual like we think, but there is still some sense of individuality. Individuality means boundary. Maybe that individuality is more expanded, and expanded, I mean more potent in a spiritual sense. It doesn't mean bigger, it means maybe smaller, but it has more potency, because it's conscious is not that. Consciousness can be less than a particle, but it knows and is everything and radiates different frequency. It's less than a particle on the physical dimension, but on the subtle dimension, it's a different body. You understand? So on the physical dimension, it can look like a particle less, not even recognizable particle, so small. But on the subtle dimension, it's a body. And on a very, very even subtler dimension, it can be something even else. But it's a more collective existence then. And so when one evolves, it means one becomes subtler and subtler and subtler. And so the understanding of yugas has to go also in the same manner, because the yuga, which is Kali Yuga at this point, is finishing with the pralaya finishing. So this time, the past 6.5 or so thousand years, it's the time where we share this frequency. We look like this, we have these gross bodies, we have all these similar frequency, which is kind of gross. Now, other yugas means subtler existence, which again appears for the collective as gross, because those beings who have that subtle body and subtle awareness, they will share again the same dimension, but they will have maybe different appearances. But for each other, they will, for each of these beings, this dimension will appear again as gross, but it will be subtle. Like in a dream, you still perceive this dimension. I mean, in the dream dimension, still somewhat gross. You still have similar buildings, no, but it's not. And the same way,
the more you are there, the more it's more concrete for you.
Right. So in the subtle dimension, if you're looking from a physical standpoint or from the current dimension, it will kind of be somewhat blurry and unusual. But if all the beings share it, it will look as if physical for them, and so on and so forth. With other higher yugas, it will look subtler and subtler, and that's why the appearance will look different. And so the subtler you go, the more different the appearance will be, because on the physical you may look like a nothing, like particle, but on the subtle you look very tall and big and potent, maybe 15 meters, 25 meters long, big body. But it's very subtle body, it's a spiritual, it's a different frequency. It's like a hologram for this frequency. It's something that is so intangible. But if there are other beings who are similar and they share the same frequency, it will look like a body. And so you understand that the yugas, the cycles, show the refinement process. When we speak about the upper cycle, when going up, evolving, it means we are refining our identity into more collective existence, into more potent, less beings, but more potency. Now, more beings, less potency, in a spiritual sense, in a sense of frequency, multidimensionality, awareness of multidimensional being, existence being. Very difficult to comprehend from the majority of people, because it's just, you can't contain that paradigm in the brain and the mind that is so limited, and which is ruled by all these different occult forces, which are collective emotions, all this pain, collective pain that has been accumulated through the down cycle, which we are to refine in order to understand what subtle dimension is. And so for this current dimension, for this current age, spirituality becomes nothing but the refinement process, not the process of expanding knowledge and understanding frequencies, because before you go into that, you have to first of all awaken to at least perceiving the subtle dimension of the first dimension, which means like dream state. And we actually separated our existence into these states, although they're inseparable, they're just like one stream of awareness, but we separated because we fragmented our existence. So now we have active state, dream state, deep sleep, and so on. So we created this sort of levels, gradations, systems, structures, which are not applicable for subtle dimension, and that's why they're not a part of natural spirituality. In the higher dimension and eras, there is natural being, natural awareness, natural knowledge. In the degraded state, everything is conceptualized, everything is brought into some kind of a paradigm, because we cannot understand without picturing it, without using our imagination, without boxing it and conceptualizing or creating some kind of streams of thoughts and ideas, because it would be incomprehensible. That's why many times we can't comprehend ancient knowledge from the higher yugas, because it's just beyond our paradigm at the moment. So we're just imagining, speculating, but we don't really know what it is. And so if we want to start restoring, we have to actually just roll up the sleeves and get ready for this dirty work, where we have to start gradually becoming aware of our corrupt identity, of all this crust that we create, all this trauma that we have been faced with, or whatever, our collective social trauma. And it seems like a lot, but slowly we will come out. That's why I said it's going to take thousands of years, because it has taken a lot of time to get to this point of corruption. And so it's going to take a lot of time, and we just have to be ready. There's no other way. Of course, people may tell you otherwise, but I mean, there has to be a level of maturity, spiritual maturity, to understand what is what. And if we look for some quick fixes, we're not going to find them. We have to understand that there is a collective trauma, there is corruption, and the first step is to become aware. And even if you have kind of regained or restored the awareness of your blissful being, let's say, it's nothing yet, because through the blissful being becomes a tool to dissolve the trauma, where you have to have enough courage, you have to have very clear guidance, and enough courage to face that ego, to face that crust, to face that limited self, so that it starts dissolving with awareness. Only awareness, which means penetrating awareness, awareness that goes into the subtle levels of self, which are now limited and kind of sort of full of crust, or wrapped up in the crust. And so it has to penetrate. Once you become aware of your issues, of the problems, of the reactions, of all these distortions, because you became aware, you may correct the pattern of reactions towards the external stimuli, or towards the external reality. And you may understand that how this external reality is the projection. But it's not just to understand theoretically, it's to actually perceive it. It's actually to take responsibility. It's actually to take oneself out of the victimhood and victimized reality paradigm. It's actually to take oneself from this desire to be a victim, or to pity oneself, or to be depressed, or not to choose to roam in the past or hope for the future, rather than really be in the present and work on oneself in the present moment. So, but yes, it's true that without deeper understanding, without true, realistic, sober understanding, we cannot really go anywhere, because we can be easily misguided by our own ego, because it's so it's the king at the moment. It has all the power to control, and our patterns of behavior can get better of us. We can be easily drawn into excuses, into same old patterns of behavior. And that's where the awareness and remembrance of the higher being is the help, where you know that I'm not this pattern, I'm not this ego talk, I'm not this, and what am I going to achieve anyways? So you have to always question yourself, and this is called self-observation, where you understand that in many situations you always, or most of the time, choose to go with the ego, with the crust, with the old pattern, even if you think that somewhat you're refining. It's very easy in some kind of crucial situations when you need to make life choices. You go back to these old patterns, to the traumatic response, and it just brings you, pulls you back into the same old paradigm. So many people they're thinking that they're doing this refinement work, but actually they're fooling themselves, because in crucial moments they fail to recognize how their ego pulled them back, or tricked them back into the same paradigm, or kind of push them away from surrender, from actually, creation of a new path or the creation of the new paradigm, which is not in the clasp of that old karmic traumatic response, but it's something new. They were manifesting it, they maybe were working on it, and all of a sudden their own ego sabotages themselves. So they give up, they excuse themselves and run back to their comfort zone. So, but to understand it theoretically, and as you listen to it, it's very easy, but when you are in that situation, it's very difficult to recognize, and that's why we need guidance in life. We need some sort of a guidance, and if we don't have that guidance, if we don't have that inner trust in our higher being, or someone who has walked the path as well, then it's very easy to get lost. There has to be some higher guidance, but not the guidance from some entities that fool you into, again, a new paradigm of self, in a new self-created identity, which means another ego, spiritual ego. It's not your spirit guides or different kind of entities that are creating another special you. It's something which is very different. So, but you have to get that access within yourself to have either higher guidance within, or to be enough humble and enough centered within the self, enough kind of balanced, or at least striving to keep that balance, to receive also the external higher guidance, because otherwise it's very difficult to walk this path. Many people walk and follow different false paths, and then they're discouraged. To find true paths is very difficult, because you need to find that frequency first within yourself. Then, because you discover that frequency within yourself, you may potentially manifest that frequency outside of you as an external guide. But to follow, to be in that state of humility, consciousness, but yet surrender at the same time, is very difficult. Because even if you discover that frequency, it doesn't mean that you have already refined and dissolved that ego crust. The ego is still there. And so when you receive guidance, your ego will try at some point to push this guidance away, or to discredit the guidance, because the ego needs to remain first. And I'm talking in very rare cases when there is a real kind of a teacher, follower, student situation, which is extremely rare. Extremely rare. It's like 1 in a billion, you may say. So in this case, yes, there has to be awareness, humility, surrender, and remembrance that my ego, my limitations will play me, will trick me. My rigidity will get better of me. My need to be special will get better of me at some point. So I need to be aware to recognize it. That's what I've written in Siddha Parampara when I talked about different traps, spiritual traps. It's very important to read it all the time, to be aware. And there are other scriptures, there are other interesting transmissions of true masters, which were very few only, that had that ability and kind of dissolve the reach through even Kali Yuga, a higher state of being. So those transmitted it very clearly, that they spoke about these tests, and again, test is not coming from the outside. It's the test of the ego. It comes from within. So they spoke about it. They spoke about traps. But when you're not aware, when you are in that experience and you choose to be not aware, or you choose to rush, or you choose to go with the flow of the ego, which is not a real flow, but it's just a saying. So you go along the lines of your rigid self. At that moment, it's nothing but blindness. And when people are in it, it's very difficult to actually take themselves out of it. And if they lose the trust in the guidance at that moment, because that's the objective of the ego, it's very difficult to actually do anything. So they need to go full round of that so that they can understand and recognize it and learn from it. And that's why it's only about the time. And there is not a single aspirant who is born in this Kali Yuga who would not be tested by their own ego, who would not be going through these kind of moments of doubt, self-doubt, of trying to find easy ways, easy paths, trying to fool themselves into a belief that life should be easier than it is, or should be a different story. If you remember that you are always what you are, and your life is just a reflection, and you take it from there, you will be able to resolve, dissolve, and master the being. The corrupt being will be dissolved, refined. But if not, it's going to take you through all kinds of situations, which you might eventually end up calling suffering. Because learning is not there. So as soon as the learning is there, and learning, how do you know that you've learned? You know when you feel absolute trust, surrender, and you come out of the state of contentment, or some people may call it love. You come out of the state of simplicity where you don't feel barriers anymore. You don't feel fears or insecurities. You're just flowing and expressing yourself. That's the moment when you are not acting out of your ego. In all other times, that's an ego play. That's your masks that you aim at dissolving through this process of self-refinement and supposedly spiritual transformation and evolution. And it's a tedious process. And even though if you observe through dreams or active state, your behavior, your patterns, your trauma, still it's the purpose is integration. The purpose is finding balance. The purpose is not to go into extremes and not to escape into any paradigm, not run from one belief to the other. The point of true spirituality is to neither believe nor disbelieve, but to be that flowing, free being, which is difficult to maintain because the ego wants structures, it wants to conserve oneself. So it cannot remain always in a fluid state. It starts from a fluid being, it starts trying to find a way to crystallize again because it feels safe. But that's a traumatic response to reality. So the ego is actually the crystallized trauma, which now has to be understood and dissolved for what it is. And to understand it, you need to understand when you flow. So you need to awaken to the natural state, which is flowing, which is accepting, which is love. And through that, through the cultivation of that, through the willful cultivation, it's like a decision in life, responsible decision. You take yourself through that being, out of the victimized state, out of the crust, out of this rigid paradigm, out of these notions that you've created for yourselves and masks behind which you hid yourself, even if they are nice, spiritual, positive masks, concepts, ideas. But yet you need the mind, you need still to work with your mind, to understand how it works, how it all of a sudden reacts. And when you recognize that this is a traumatic response, and you know that otherwise you choose to behave out of love, out of contentment, out of this flowing, nice, openly communicating free being. So you start overpowering, you start choosing consciously, even if you chose for a second, again, this rigid, traumatized, fearful, insecure response, you choose to overpower it and surrender into the natural being, allowing things to flow, allowing to be, from the ego point of view, vulnerable, but from the highest standpoint, natural, open and flowing. And so this way, you start so-called cultivating the natural being. You start dissolving this ego crust slowly, slowly, because you give it less and less power. Because you're focusing on this, not on the crust. And you start recognizing when the old trauma kicks in, when the old response kicks in, and you neutralize it by surrendering. I don't need to show my ego here. I don't need to be right. I don't need to defend. I don't need to demonstrate. I don't need to be special. I don't need to be validated. I don't need to be acknowledged. I don't need to prove everyone something or the world that I'm this or that. So when you recognize this for ego, you understand that all I need is just surrender. And with that surrender comes relaxation. With that surrender comes clarity. With that surrender comes clear solution. And that's it. It seems simple, but for the ego, once it's on a trip or on its mission to destroy and to destroy your newly found sort of way, it will attack. It will. How does the ego attacks? How does the ego attack? It attacks through suggestions, through doubtful thoughts, self-doubt, fear, insecurities, depressive emotions, pity, guilt, shame. It will throw these emotions and thoughts and stories and past issues and will not blind you so that you cannot see things clearly. To see things clearly is to see from the perspective of contentment, openness, free being. But to see to be blindfolded or to see through this veil means to see through these emotions, guilt, thoughts of shame, not enough, I'm insecure and fearful, lack of courage, because this being is courageous. It doesn't see life as a threat. It doesn't see life as some kind of a conquest, or doesn't see life as ambition. It sees life as an abundant flow where everything is possible, everything is changeable, everything is flowing, everything is given. It's abundance. But this does not know abundance because it knows control, because it's limited, it's rigid, it knows only rigid paths. If I don't work, I don't get anything. If I don't believe, I don't get anything. So it's a rigid construct of self. And if it continues working there on the periphery, it becomes your occult being, the one that will attack you. Occult because it's hidden, you are not always aware. And it gives you very subtle suggestions. So it starts creeping in very, very subtly. So that's why it's so difficult to recognize. Because if it just came all of a sudden like this, you would clearly recognize, you would see a difference between this state and this. But it doesn't come this way. It's sneaky. It creeps in very subtly. And then it tries to slowly, slowly, slowly paralyze this natural being and create this invisible crust and then tighten it up. That's how our ego works. It gives us a suggestion, no, I can't just live in this state of abundance. I need to do, I need to. It creates this self-doubt. These are so-called undercurrents. If you want to pursue this stream, but you have these undercurrents, they will, slow you down. And this is what happens. Usually people don't understand. They feel that they actively want to do this and that, but then they don't notice how the self-doubt creeps in and it paralyzes their action. Because after all, it doesn't matter what you think or even what you feel, because if you cannot reach the point of action, it's useless. So the ego will try to paralyze action. You may feel like you want to talk, you may feel like you want to express yourself, you may feel like you want to do this, but this ego paradigm paralyzes. Because after all, the target is to paralyze the action. So if you can't act, there's nothing happening in this projected reality. So it's very, very important to learn and observe with detachment all these different movements within one's consciousness. These thoughts arising, these doubts arise, these, that, and not to act upon, not to create a thought that this is me. Because the moment you create a thought or you connect that this is me, this is really how I am, and this is how my life is going to be for the rest of my life, you are captured. You are a victim again of your own ego, nothing else. You're paralyzed now. And in this moment, you are nothing but weak. What does it mean to be paralyzed? your creative being is paralyzed, because this which is free, natural, is creative being. That's why we say spiritual awakening, Kundalini awakening, because it's an awakening to that abundant, blissful flow of being, which is natural, which is not encrusted into anything. Yeah, it's not blocked by anything. But the ego is a crust. So when we awaken to that natural being, the ego will naturally start antagonizing, because it tries to return to the safe, limited, blocked paradigm, until your consciousness teaches itself and overpowers, dissolves this crust, dissolves these patterns, dissolves these traumatic responses. So until then, there will be always a risk that an old paradigm will take over, at least on some level. If not on a gross emotional level, on a spiritual level, maybe you'll try to create another paradigm. I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that. Because if you are something, you don't need to announce or be this or that. You are already that. That's clear. It's clear for you and it's clear for others. It doesn't need to be, boxed or tagged. Ego tries to box, tag, crystallize, and make it into a crust. And so it's very important to understand in the spiritual work. When you do spiritual work, you recognize these currents very clearly. Without this recognition, you can't understand the role of this subtle spiritual being. The role is not to create another guru or teacher in this physical projected reality paradigm. The point is to pull your true being, meaning dissolve this crust, to understand that this is my being. And I'm not to create another ego about this being because it's blissful. I am to understand the traumatic response, the crust, the rigidity, the obscurity of my masks, my false identities, because this allows me to understand the reality. The ultimate reality is the reality of surrender, courage, free expression, openness, right? Love, contentment, whatever the word you use in the human language, you can perceive it right now. This is the being. So when this being is there, it can clearly tell you when you are suppressed. And when you're suppressed in the physical body, you are stressed, you are contracted. Here in the physical body, you are relaxed. Here in the physical body, you're contracted, you're tormented, you're anxious. It tells you you are not allowing surrender. You are not really in your natural spiritual being. You are in the ego mode. So how people recognize ego mode? They are victimized, they are anxious, they're fearful, they're insecure, they lack courage, they lack openness, they're in the head all the time. They are constantly analyzing, judging, logically assuming, projecting, and driving themselves literally insane, because constantly being in your head and judging, assuming what if this, what if that, it's insanity. That's insanity. And we can say, yeah, everyone is like this. Yes, we're living in a mental asylum. Welcome. This is insanity, because this is how our egos are driving us insane, yet we cannot just surrender and let it go, because we need to feel that we're in control. Because it tells us that if we surrender, we'll be vulnerable, we will be hurt, we will be judged. But we judge and hurt ourselves all the time by staying in here. So that's what we don't understand. So instead of choosing our true being, we choose the corrupt being, even if this being is wrapped up in a spiritual paradigm for now. Even if we excuse ourselves that we're doing good and it's still a spiritual prison with positive intentions. It's still a crust. And this is what majority of people fail to understand. They run from one prison into the other, where the solution is very easy. Surrender, relax, you'll be there. When you're this, you're simple, you're attractive, you're open, you're lovable, you're content, you're free-flowing, you're very creative, you're wise, You're not coming from trauma. You're not emotionally response in a traumatic way. You're nurturing. You're nurturing yourself and you're nurturing others. People just perceive the nurturing being within you. This dissolves this. And when you are absorbed, meditative absorption means you're this. You cultivate this. It means you remind yourself and you go into that being. And I'm not saying words that you sit with eyes closed. No, you are this being. This being is so blissful. This being is pure contentment, it's pure love. You can say it's God, it's love, it's bliss. These are just words, but this is the being. You can take away all the words, but remain with the being. The truth is the being, not the words that people propagate. The truth is the being. Awakening is to the being and cultivating the being. And through this being, dissolving this crust. That's the purpose of spiritual refinement. And it doesn't happen in a forceful way. Oh, I'm now refining myself. It's not a manual work. It's you're living your life. You continue living your life, but then it seems, oh, it's boring. It's not nice. I'd rather go to an ashram. It's kind of a more entertaining paradigm. I'd rather go and become a part of this or become a part of that. No. It means going into the natural stream of your own natural being, the reality, living life, transforming not only yourself, but what your life flow, because you transforming yourself. So your life flow transforming too, and you're gaining new knowledge, everything changes, people change, surrounding changes. But when you go with the ego, you just go back to the comfortable paradigm, to that which you know. You're not able to flow and expand. So you're just sitting somewhere, or wasting time, or holding on to something that you should let go and allow the flow to take you. But to allow the flow to take you means to surrender. Ego has the biggest difficulty and fear to surrender. People who act out of trauma fear surrender. Because surrender means they become natural. They want to hold on to masks. And so they don't succeed in life. Or they succeed in a limited way when they could have expanded and could have seen so much more. So limitation means it's not only limiting your perception, but it's limiting everything that you could have experienced in your life. And this is sad, but this is the reality of life. Yeah.